Welcome to Food and Facilities, an online show for West Coast Industrial Solutions magazine. Our goal is to cultivate knowledge to feed the world by focusing our quarterly trade issues on safety, compliance, and innovation within manufacturing, agriculture, food processing, and food and beverage industries. In this episode of Food and Facilities on CentralValleyTalk.com, we'll be discussing the conflict between solar development, farmland conservation, and environmental protection with Robert Selna of Selna Partners LLP. Welcome to Food and Facilities. I'm Tara Sweeney, Marketing Director for West Coast Industrial Solutions magazine, soon to be Planting to Processing, thanks to your social media votes. And we now have our new logo. If you would like to subscribe to our magazine, you can go to wcismag.com/subscribe and get all of the safety and compliance news for manufacturing, food and beverage, food processing, and agriculture. One of our sponsors today is Fine Print Plus. They're your source for printing, packing, and promotion. They do graphic design, print and copies, custom apparel, promotional items, a parcel service, and they recently started a will call and delivery service. You can reach them at area code 559-237-4747. Email them any of your graphics needs at graphics@fineprintplus.com. or request a quote at fineprintplus.com/quote. Another one of our sponsors is Safe Food Alliance. When it comes to food safety, they've got you covered. Drop in and see them in their Food Safety Center in Kingsburg, California, or visit them online at safefoodalliance.com. My first guest today is Robert Selna of Selna Partners. He discussed solar development versus environmental protection for farmland with me. And you can reach him at robert@selnapartners.com or give him a call at 415-601-5385. I'm here with Robert Selna of Selna Partners LLP, and he's here to discuss about the conflict between environmental protection of farmland and solar development. Here's Robert Selna, and can you give us a little background about yourself and Selna Partners?
Sure. Morning, Tara. Thank you, and thanks again for having me on your show. Selna Partners formed actually in April 2020, so about 9 months ago, and we are a firm that focuses specifically on real estate and land use issues. We represent a number of agricultural interests, and we focus on, in addition to just general agriculture, vineyards and cattle and those types of entities. We also represent cannabis and hemp companies in California, and we have a heavy focus on real estate, and we think that those two things go together sort of symbiotically, obviously, and so we feel like it's a good combination of things. And the third thing we focus on is litigation. My brother Steve is a longtime litigator, and I'm a longtime real estate and land use attorney, and so we complement each other, we believe, in that way. And it's been an interesting 9 months for everybody, but we've found that many of the issues that existed in the agriculture, whether it be cannabis, hemp, or other agricultural or land issues, have persisted through this strange time we're living in, and we've had a lot of work and been busy, and so we're happy to be working together and enjoying running our own firm. So that's our sort of brief history, and I think, as we've talked about, there's just a number of really interesting environmental issues that are here now and on the horizon as California and other states transition to renewable energy. I think different numbers get thrown around. I know it's 60% renewables by 2030 in California, and I believe it's 100% renewables by 2060 in California. California set those goals a little while ago, but has been ramping up its environmental programs and environmental goals beyond those, including electrifying all vehicles by, I think it's 2045 or 2050. It's relatively soon, whatever it is. Maybe even sooner than that, but that just was released recently. And with the change in administration in Washington, there's going to be a much more stronger willingness from the federal government to support California's efforts. Obviously, California is the biggest state in the union and has the largest population by far, and so really takes a leadership role in these kinds of issues. In the article I wrote for the magazine, I noted that the Nature Conservancy statistic that says about 1 million to 3 million acres of solar and wind development are going to be needed to completely transition to green energy by 2050. And what that raises is something that you wouldn't necessarily think about unless it was presented to you, which is that there will be conflicts between this desire to transition to renewable energy and protecting the natural environment itself, because solar panels, as one example, take up a lot of acreage. And the most efficient way to produce solar energy is through what's called utility scale solar. And that's essentially finding flat land that is close to a substation and putting as many solar panels in that land and connecting it to the substation and putting it on the grid. And what that means is that you have solar panels occupying formerly agricultural land, or generally just sort of unused dry farming land. It might have been for hay, it might have been for cattle. And so there's this inherent clash. And meanwhile, the state of California is concerned about losing too much more agricultural land, because we're obviously an people forget. You don't forget because you're in Fresno, but we're an agricultural state and supply the country and the world with food. And so there's these tensions, like many other things as our society modernizes. There's no easy answers, right? And so it requires thoughtful planning to get these things right. You can't just say categorically solar's good, we should put it anywhere and everywhere, because you could be defeating your own purposes of helping the environment by doing that. And some jurisdictions have understood this, local jurisdictions and regions have understood this issue and have done some significant planning around it. So the Nature Conservancy I quoted has recommended, given the need for all this land, there needs to be some significant thought put into where solar panels or wind generation should go. And that ultimately comes down to a county or city level, because counties and cities control the general plan and the zoning, which dictates what can be built where and at what size and with what conditions, et cetera. And so as examples, Contra Costa County, Santa Clara County, and those county governments promoted and paid for studies to figure out what the least conflict areas were. Least conflict meaning where would utility scale solar have the least impact on environmental resources and agricultural land and valuable agricultural land and open space. And then UC Berkeley conducted a study for the San Joaquin Valley region on the same topic, sort of mapping and identifying where in this area would we be able to generate a significant amount of solar power, but avoid harming areas we want to preserve, or areas with natural resources, or areas with valuable environmental characteristics. And some jurisdictions haven't done that. And what I have found, at least in one jurisdiction that hasn't done it, is that inevitably there's a conflict. because there's not certainty for solar developers around where they should go and at what size and scale they can build. And then there are inherently environmentalists on the side of solar development, sort of categorically. And then there are environmentalists almost categorically on the side of preserving the natural environment, no matter where it is. And so that conflict, I think, will play itself out repeatedly in California if jurisdictions don't do what Santa Clara and Contra Costa and UC Berkeley did for the San Joaquin Valley. And an area where I'm working and have a case, it's not a case yet, but it may become litigation, is in Alameda County, in eastern Alameda County, where a number of years ago, about 10 years ago, the county started down a path of doing these types of studies, the least conflict studies that I described, but never completed them. And in the meantime, the interest in solar development has gotten greater. The cost of solar panels has come down dramatically. So within the last year, I think there was a 350% increase in solar development in the state. And there's about 9,000 permits pending to build utility scale solar. And it just really quickly, I'll pause. The difference between utility scale solar and rooftop solar is utilities mounted into the ground, rooftops on rooftops. And most people are more familiar with the rooftop. You know, you see it on houses, you see it on parking garages and areas that get a lot of sun. Fewer people have seen utility scale because it's often in more remote areas. There isn't as much of it out there at the moment, but there will be more. So in any event, Alameda County started down this path because they, like everyone, common sense, they knew it was going to lead to conflicts if they didn't do it. But they never completed the work. And Alameda County has eastern Alameda County, which is very rural. For those who aren't familiar with it, I mean, Alameda County includes Oakland, Berkeley, cities in the East Bay, a lot of cities, and it's more known for its cities. But there's a significant amount of acreage that's completely rural in Livermore, Dublin, Pleasanton, and all the way out to Tracy, basically. And so that's where there's been interest from solar developers in Alameda County. And as I said, they started down this path to doing planning, didn't do it, got a lot of interest from solar, and they approved a couple of projects that were very small in an area called Mountain House out near Tracy back in the 2010 time period. And then there was kind of a lull in the interest for solar development of this type. And then in recent years, they got more interest. And the problem was they hadn't done the policy work to identify the least conflict areas. And they basically opened all of eastern Alameda County to solar. And so if you look at a map of East County, it would be hundreds of thousands of acres that would be covered with solar panels if you accept the county's interpretation of what's allowed out there now. And I don't think they really understood what the ramifications of how they were approving these projects, or saying that the approvals of those projects were precedent for future projects. And in 2018, a very large project came in, proposed for an area in North Livermore Valley, which is a protected scenic rural recreational route for bike riders and drivers who want to take a nice Sunday drive out in the country. And a company came in and proposed about 700 acres would be occupied for a 400 solar panel acre project. And it would occupy the vast majority of the western side of this scenic source, North Livermore Valley. And so the other thing about Alameda County that's interesting is that it has a no growth measure that was put in place by voters in 2010, which says basically you can't do any development of any significant size outside of a boundary. And the only uses and the goal of the measure was to protect agricultural land and open space. So Alameda County has sort of these these interesting sort of details in that they were going to start this planning, they didn't do it. They also have this measure that doesn't allow development outside of a boundary. And what they've done is they've said this type of development, utility scale solar, doesn't count as development according to the measure. And a lot of people think that's just not correct. It's not inherently agricultural. If you ask somebody on the street, are solar panels an agricultural use, they would say absolutely not. The way the county has justified its interpretation is to say that in its code, you can interpret the code to mean that solar, utility scale solar, is an agricultural use. And so that's how they're getting sort of, I would say, getting around the prohibition of development outside this boundary. And so there's a pretty significant battle that has developed in North Livermore Valley, ranchers there, property owners, environmental groups, and just some people concerned about good government, frankly, and about how this process went forward in the county, have come out against this massive solar project and have asked me to represent them. And mostly what I've done so far is try to communicate to the county that this needs to be planned correctly, like Santa Clara County did, like Contra Costa County did, and like was done in San Joaquin and the San Joaquin Valley. And unfortunately, the problem is for the county, I think, they accepted this application for the project, and they deemed the application complete. And in a way, the developer was led to believe they could do this here. Yet the county had failed to do its policy work, right? And Measure D, the measure that controls the growth, said that the county supervisors and the staff were responsible for the protection of the requirements of Measure D, and they've generally failed to do that. So the county's in a bind because they've allowed this to happen. They've allowed the application to be deemed complete and to process it. When they do that, it starts to give the applicant some rights. They don't really have what's called vested rights yet, but they'd have some actionable claims if they were led to believe they could do something by the county, and in fact they weren't. Possibly, at least they can make those claims. And I think the county believes, even if they would prefer to pause this and complete their policy work and their amendments that are necessary to allow this to happen, they'd be in trouble with the developer, right? And in a sort of more general sense and not a technical or legal sense, the county is also committed to solar power development to be green and to help the state meet its goals. So on the one hand, I'm somewhat sympathetic to the county, but also they put themselves in this position. And the appropriate remedy for this is probably to just deny this project and have them start over, or modify it in such a way that it has fewer impacts, maybe a much smaller project, maybe a project that doesn't impact the aesthetics of the area as much, maybe a project that could be in a different part of East County that isn't in a scenic corridor. There are a number of ways it could be done differently, and unfortunately, I think that's where we are. And there's a hearing probably in early February at the Alameda County Board of Supervisors on this issue. And the project, if people are interested, the project is called the Aramis Solar Project. There's a number of news articles on it in the Livermore Independent and in the San Francisco Chronicle and other papers. And that's because it's so large, and because of this major controversy that has developed over it.
I know in the Midwest, a lot of farmers were actually getting financial incentive to actually develop solar on their land. both on their structures that they already have, and then also on swaths for the utility style ones like you were explaining.
Yeah.
And counterintuitively, a lot of solar development places actually rent out grazing animals in order to clean up all the grasslands that their panels are built on. So you'd think that we could figure out a way to kind of mesh them together without necessarily having to have this conflict. But once you have the ordinances and the zoning, it's hard to get the ability to do both.
Yeah, that's interesting. I'd be interested in seeing some of the articles you read about that, because one of the things that Aramis Project is recommending in Alameda County is just that, having sheep on site to basically do weed control in and around the panels. This has historically been cattle ranching areas, and most ranchers out there don't think having sheep do weed abatement is agriculture. And that this developer has just put that in order to, in essence, pretend that it's agriculture when it's really not. I think there probably is a way to do solar development where you could have cattle. And you could have sheep if that's economically viable. The thing about sheep, apparently, and I'm not an expert on sheep, but it's not particularly economically viable other than for weed abatement in California. I haven't researched that in depth, but one of the members of a group that I represent said there's no economic benefit to raising sheep right now, particularly. But you would think with some technological innovations, maybe raising the height of the solar panels up high enough so that there was plenty of room below them to graze cattle, maybe put them on more substantial structures. I think the cost would go up were you to do that. That would make them more like windmills, frankly, which I think are compatible with agriculture, because there's it's a big, tall, relatively big diameter pole, but it doesn't take up all the ground, right? So I see a windmill, a wind electric generator as a fundamentally different use, categorically different use from ground-mounted solar. Because you can see photos on the web, ground-mounted solar essentially covers the ground. There's a little room typically between the ground and the top of the solar panel, but not much, which is why they're using sheep and not cattle, because there's no room under there. The other interesting thing that, ranchers and farmers would be interested in is that the Williamson Act comes into play in this issue. And the Williamson Act provides tax benefits, as you probably know, for land that's dedicated to agriculture, and where the owner dedicates the land. And, it's like 90% of whatever parcel is under the Williamson Act has to be dedicated for an agricultural use. And in Alameda County, the way the Williamson Act is implemented on a county level is through something called uniform rules, typically. They create rules and interpret the Williamson Act. And in Alameda County, they say you have to count, if the solar panels are mounted on the ground and not on a rooftop, you have to count them towards the acreage that's non-agricultural, right? So you can have 10 acres or 10% non-agricultural use. And the county has said, well, solar panels aren't agricultural use in that context. And you have to count them if they're on the ground rather than if they're on a roof. All you have to do is count the roof, because you'd be double counting basically if you counted the roof and the panels. And the county has tried to get around that, again, kind of tried to get around something by saying, because sheep can get under the panels and graze, you don't have to count the panels, which is, a little dubious in my view. If the uniform rules say you have to count them, you have to count them. So that's interesting to hear that they're doing that in the Midwest as well. And there's this really important tension. I'm not saying this isn't an easy situation. I'm a proponent of solar all the way. I have solar on my house. I drive an electric car. I'm kind of a typical Bay Area, person who's really into renewable energy. But I'm on the side of those who are opposed to it in this case on the utility scale solar situation, because it really would be damaging to the natural environment there, which is full of biological resources. Even though it's cattle land, there's all kinds of salamanders and foxes and owls and badgers and all kinds of things that you wouldn't even imagine out there. And there'll be a fence around the entire project. And so, one of the things that biological resources like those I named need is room to move between corridors. And this just cuts off their transportation between different environments. So in any event, yeah, it's a bit of a sticky situation. And I think the Alameda County case is just so happens to be a really good example. But as I was saying, so in this case, I'm on the side of those opposing solar, because it's more nuanced than categorically solar is good, categorically environmental preservation is good. And I think increasingly as a society, we're having to think in a more nuanced way about these things. I mean, if somebody were to say, hey, cut down a redwood forest and fill it with solar panels, everybody would say, no, you can't do that, right? Right? Wouldn't make any sense. It's similar here. It's a scenic valley. There aren't that many scenic valleys left. There's not that much agricultural land left. There's a desire to preserve it. And so it's been interesting to sort of have to address that presumption that all solar is good, particularly when myself and many of the other people I represent are proponents of solar. So it's almost like, you start out by apologizing. Hey, I'm sorry, I really believe in solar, but, And there's just a culture in California now which has really set up this opposition between landowners and property owners and those trying to develop things. And that kind of comes from the housing perspective. The acronym NIMBYism has become commonplace because not in my backyard, because of the housing crisis and the need to build more housing. And I think there's a temptation by those who want solar at all costs to sort of apply that dynamic to this dynamic, and it doesn't fit nearly as well. So,
and like you said, solar panels are becoming more fiscally available for more people.
Yeah.
And it's fostering a lot of innovation. So you're going to have to talk even more in the future about how people are deciding to reuse the panels in different innovative ways. And
yeah,
I have to cover that legally also.
Yeah, we'll see where it goes. Solar's gotten extraordinarily inexpensive. I mean, the cost has come way down, which is why it's become such a popular choice for the state meeting its renewable energy goals. It's cheap. The panels are cheap. The land's not cheap, and the impact on the land is not cheap. But the panels themselves are. A lot of people say, well, why don't you just cover, cities with panels? That's certainly a possibility. It's just more expensive. And so then you get into what kind of incentive do companies and investors need to invest in these types of projects? Because without that investment, they won't happen. So a company like Aramis could go try to get leases with 400 buildings in Oakland and try to connect all that to a substation somewhere. Probably be closer to, they'd probably be pretty close to some substations, but the infrastructure needed and all the leases needed and all the other details that go into that would make it far more expensive than taking a big flat valley and turning it into a sea of solar panels. So it's more, the bottom line is it's more expensive to piecemeal it by putting it on roofs in urban areas than it is to just take up natural land for it, unfortunately. And I think that possibly will be addressed by innovation. I hope it is, because that would relieve some of this conflict, probably.
Well, thank you for joining me today. Is there anything else you'd like to add about solar panels and farmland?
I mean, there's a lot more I could talk about, but I guess um, I would urge those, those who have access to or are leaders themselves in the agricultural community, and in the environmental community throughout California to be aware of this issue and to raise it with their city or county elected leaders and planning department or community development department staff, to get them to start thinking about it soon now. Because they'll come around to a conflict if they don't address it in advance. And there may still be conflicts if they plan well, but smart planning will make this better for everybody. And I would just urge those who are interested in good government and good planning and renewable energy and protecting agricultural land and the environment to get involved in this issue. I think it's flown under the radar to some degree, and if not confronted with the issue, people put solar in a good category, they put ag land in a good category, and they don't think about how they might come together in a bad way. There are areas in Southern California where they banned solar panels altogether in agricultural areas, like parts of San Bernardino County and LA County have, for this reason. And maybe that, was an extreme reaction. I don't know. I don't know enough about those areas. But the opposite thing happened in Alameda County, where basically you can build solar. If you look at a map, as I said at the outset, you could build solar panels on hundreds of thousands of acres of East County. And clearly the voters didn't want that, and probably not even what the county staff intended. And government has a difficult time, understandably, government has a difficult time getting out in front of things. They're often very reactive. There's a problem, they try to solve it, rather than, hey, we see a problem coming, let's try to get out in front of it. As I said, some counties have been able to do that. So there's models out there. There's blueprints out there. Again, I'll repeat, Contra Costa, Santa Clara County have done it. So their reports, their studies are available for people to see. And then the UC Berkeley study on the San Joaquin Valley is out there for people to see. So, anybody who's watching this and has an interest in that should get involved. There's an opportunity to get involved. There's an opportunity to get out in front of this in most places in the state. So
it's a great call to action to end our talk for today. Thank you for speaking with me today, Rob, and I look forward to talking with you on further farmland, cannabis, real estate, and litigation.
All right, sounds good, Tara. Thank you. Have a good rest of the day. All right.
You too.
Bye.
If you would like assistance with litigation, real estate, and cannabis and hemp, make sure to reach out to Robert Selna at Selna Partners LLP at robert@selnapartners.com or give him a call at 415-601-5385. And another one of our sponsors is Dynamic Coatings Incorporated. They are a concrete restoration and flooring solution. They have seamless, antimicrobial, durable, dustproof, and fast cure flooring solutions. They are USDA, FDA, OSHA, and HACCP approved. You can visit them at dciflooring.com or give them a call at their Sacramento location at 916-485-6800, 510-352-7000 at their Oakland location, 559-225-4605 at their Fresno location, or 562-634-9887 at their Los Angeles location. Another one of our sponsors is California Food Producers. You can visit them at clfp.com or give them a call at 640-8150 on labor laws, water regulation, Proposition 65, labeling requirements, regulating chemicals, drinking water, transportation, greenhouse gas emissions, and cap and trade. And now we will have a moment of silence for our Black Lives Matter community.